This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Alison McCreesh. Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this show I talk with Alison McCreesh. Her latest book, Norths, 2 Suitcases and a Stroller Around the Circumpolar World, came out last month from Conundrum Press, and I talk with Alison about the new work, her penchant for traveling, and the links between her art and a deep love of northern climates. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And as we often tout on the podcast, one of the best ways of getting your comics is in bundled form. And at Discount Comic Book Service, you can get a variety of these bundles at prices that are much lower than what you'd pay for the individual issues. For example, in the month of May, you can get the Marvel Legacy Bundle of 39 comic books or the Marvel Fresh Start Bundle of 28 comics, both at 50% off at the cover price, and the 8-issue Valiant Bundle at 50% off as well. And DC has a whole slew of bundles for you to choose from, including 2 DC Universe bundles, the DC New Miniseries Bundle, a Young Animal Bundle, their New Age of Heroes Bundle, and a DC Kids Bundle, all at either 45% or 50% off of what you'd pay regularly. There's just no way around it. You can't beat the great prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please send them an email and tell them that the 2 guys with PhDs sent you. Readers of Alison McCreesh's 2015 work, Ramshackle, a Yellowknife Story, know about the draw northern climates has on her and the love she has for pioneer-like exploration. In her new book, Norths, 2 Suitcases and a Stroller Around the Circumpolar World, released last month from Conundrum Press, Alison ramps up those affections. It's an account of her 6-month trip to circumpolar regions and her time in 4 art residencies in Finland, Russia, Greenland, and Iceland, all above the 60th parallel. Traveling with her partner Patrice and her son Riel, Alison kept a diary of her experiences in the form of postcards that she sent off almost daily to friends and supporters who had agreed to back her project. The result is a unique travelogue in sequential postcard form of her exploration of northern climates, her experiences at the various residencies, and her attempts at trying to balance life, work, and family. Norths is an engaging hybrid text, and I have an insightful talk with Alison about her process and whether or not she considers the book a work of comic art. So let's listen to that conversation now. Let's start off with letting our listeners know that you and I have been meaning to do this interview for a number of weeks now, but I think I had contacted you right when things were starting to heat up for you, Alison, and that is you were about to give birth, and then that happened around the time we were thinking about doing the interview.
Yeah, I think that's how things went down. I was in that limbo of a baby likely to come anytime. And then the baby did come. And And now I'm in the post-baby, slightly frazzled phase of new parenthood.
Yeah, and congratulations. And
Thank you.
I hope that Sam is happy and healthy.
Yes, yes, yes. All has been going great. We even made it to TCAF this past weekend, so no complaints. So far, so good. Easier the second time around.
Yeah, and in fact, TCAF was another complication in our potential plans because right after giving birth, then there was TCAF, and you decided to go to TCAF even with a newborn.
Well, a 1 month old by then. I was humming and hawing, like about would we go or wouldn't we? And then it was just, she was a big, healthy, strong baby, and everything went well, and I was feeling good about it. And that combined with a few other personal reasons for travel, we just thought, let's do it. And we did, and it went great and fine, and I'm glad we decided to do it.
Well, perhaps Sam can be a part of your next project because I know that in your new book, Norths, 2 Suitcases and a Stroller Around the Circumpolar World, your firstborn, Riel, was a very big part of that narrative.
Yes, yes. Well, I had traveled a lot before having the baby, before with Patrice, my partner, and alone before that as well. And we'd always thought if someday we had a kid anyway to start out with, we'd try and get some big epic traveling done with the kid before the kid turned 2 and had to pay for plane tickets and other kind of travel. So when Riel came, when we had our first baby, we started planning for a big endeavor, a big worldwide, a big trip.
In fact, much of Norths, which we need to talk about its format, but it's in, I guess, postcard style where you send postcards to a variety of different people and then you collect those in book form, which in essence is what we have in Norths. But in the story, Riel is front and center because of you and Patrice having to accommodate for him, Patrice in particular having to care for him while you're off working with your residencies. And it was just an interesting twist on this circumpolar tour that you guys made.
Yeah, I mean, Riel did, I guess when you have kids, the kids do become an enormous part of your life, whether you're at home or you're traveling. And yeah, he was, we were on the road, we were traveling. I was the one working, so Pat was the stay-at-home parent, and they had to find many ways to basically kill time, I guess. Those are, it was the winter, and it was circumpolar destinations, and often they were fairly small towns. So one of the biggest challenges was just sort of that day-to-day, like not getting bored and not getting cabin fever, and trying to find places to go with an almost 2-year-old in the wintertime when it's cold and dark.
Well, let's talk about this new book, Norths, and where this idea came from. Now, from reading some of your other material, looking at your website, I can tell that you love to travel and you can't stand still, but this was quite an undertaking. So I'm curious, how long was this in the making, and did you decide from the beginning to use these travels as a basis for a book project?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm not sure what part to answer first. My fried mum brain. The trip. So we had this plan that we were going to travel when we had the baby and before the baby was 2. And then we were a bit fuzzy as to what we were going to do. We knew we didn't want to just be backpacking around for too long, like changing places all the time. We've done that before. And even without a child, that had sort of grown old. We knew we wanted to go somewhere and really live there. And then we sort of had to pick where and how was that going to be possible financially and with what would make sense. And so I started looking into art residencies. And from there, I think one thing sort of led to another. All my arts practice, the comics, but also just my illustration work, and I sort of have a fiber arts practice as well, has been inspired by Northern Canada ever since I moved north. So now we're going on 10 years. So slowly we had the idea that maybe this trip and these residencies might be an opportunity to explore other Norths and to make work about other Norths. So that's sort of how that idea came about. And we had the idea of 6 months in duration, approximately. And we knew we had to be back basically, well, not too long, ideally before Riel turned 2, or otherwise just a little bit after. Because once kids turn 2, then they start costing a lot of money on planes and in transit. So we had all these parameters to cobble together, and then, I had to decide where we'd go, and I don't even remember what I'm answering anymore. What the big travel? Oh, and the book project. I knew this would be fodder for all kinds of work. This big trip, while I was on the trip, and also after. The actual residencies I was applying to do weren't directly related to the book project or to comics. They were more surrounding fiber arts. But I knew that on the side, I'd be wanting to either make a book as I traveled, or at least accumulate material to use to make a book about it after. And at some point throughout all the planning and the thinking it through and trying to figure out what these projects would be, and also trying to figure out some fundraising, I came up with the idea of doing this postcard project, which then became Norths, the book as we now know it.
Now, you explained this in the book, but for our listeners who may not be familiar with it yet, and they should be, by the way, because this is a fascinating read, what do you mean by Norths?
What do I mean by Norths? Well, I live in, I guess what we could have done to really set this up is say that I live in Yellowknife, which is pretty far north in Canada, which is, I guess for your American listeners, we're kind of the equivalent of Alaska in terms of latitude. We're up north of the 60th parallel. And so by Canadian standards, by most Canadian standards, that's pretty far north. In Canada, there's the 60th parallel that bisects the country. And above the 60th parallel is where we have our territories. So we have the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And below that, they're the provinces. So up here, the 60th parallel has a lot of meaning because it's sort of that one of those lines that sort of makes you feel like you're further north. And so people up here do sort of identify with being in the north, and like it's part of like people are proud of it and talk about it quite a lot and definitely identify as northern. Then, so that's how that's been influencing my work. And I also, for a few years back now, ended up traveling all over the Arctic for a completely different work for another project. But that really put the North into a whole other perspective for me, because by Southern Canadian perspective, Yellowknife is super far north. But then once you travel up to the high Arctic, Yellowknife's the southern hub. We even have trees down here. So
it's all relative, huh?
Yeah, the North is super relative. That's one thing I've learned throughout all these years of living and traveling in the North, is just how relative the idea of North is, and how you're always south of someone, and how there are so many ways of defining North. Up here, we use that north of 60 idea a lot to define North. But of course, there's so many different ways that it's not just latitude that makes you North. And so when I embarked on this trip, I knew I wanted to go and experience different Norths, but I also had this experience in knowing how relative North is. And so I had to pick some parameters to define what North was going to be. So I picked the north of 60, the latitude thing, because up here that's so important. And that's such a big part of defining what is North, where I live. And then I took into account the other notion that is sort of being a circumpolar country. So there are 8 countries that count as circumpolar nations. And there's Canada, and we already live here and live north of 60, so that one was taken care of. And then there's Alaska in the US, which I unfortunately didn't make it to for a slew of logistical reasons, amongst which that I just didn't find a residency that was north of 60 and that could accommodate us. And then there was the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and then Russia and Greenland and Iceland. So throughout all of those, I found residencies that were north of 60 and applied and managed to somehow get them all to line up. It was a lot of planning and logistics. And then we embarked on our trip, always staying north of 60 and making it to all those different circumpolar nations.
Now, you had 4 residencies in locations north of the 60th parallel, right?
Exactly, yep.
Yeah. Now, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the names, but I think your first residency was is pronounced Lapua, Finland?
Lapua,
okay.
yeah.
And then after that, you went to Petrovsk, Russia?
Petrodzavodsk.
Okay, Petrovsk.
They're all tricky, all of them.
Zavatsk. Okay, Petrovsk.
Yep.
And then in this one, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be butchering Kekortok, South Greenland.
I think that's a pretty good Kekortok. I'm not even sure where. I don't think I'm even saying it right. So, but Kekortok is how we were rolling with it.
And then your last one was at Blunduos, Iceland?
And this one I think we still butcher even after living there for a month. Blundus is my closest. Yep.
Okay.
Attempt.
Yeah. See, I safely prefaced my attempt by saying I'm going to butcher these names. But thank you for helping me with those. So you had those 4 residencies, and that's basically how the book Norths is structured, is you and Patrice's and Riel's time in these 4 locations. But even during these residencies, you visited other locations that was north of the 60th parallel. So you guys got to do quite a bit of sightseeing.
Yes, though, I mean, all things considered, we didn't wander that much because, well, with the toddler and the winter and all the commitments I had to the residencies, we were fairly, we didn't move around as much as one might expect. But especially in Finland was where we made a point of really going out on a mission, because from Finland, I wanted us to go to Norway and Sweden. And the Finnish residency lasted 2 months, and it was fairly low key, and they didn't have too many issues with us just wandering off. So from there, we got a Scandinavian rail pass and really traveled up, always staying north of 60, up north through Sweden and Norway. In Norway, we even made it up north of the Arctic Circle. So that was our northern train trip.
You know, one of the things that comes up throughout the book, but especially I would say in the last half of Norths, is your comments about feeling that you are not getting out enough because of the residencies, that you're doing good work, but you're not really seeing things like you had planned to, and maybe not spending as much time with Patrice and Riel.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny how this is in one way, it was such a big epic journey, but in another way, it was just very much day-to-day life, just going to work and plowing on with the grind, only in more exotic locations. And yeah, as it went on, I did just start feeling, I've traveled a lot before, and I know that, it's the people you meet that make a place, and it's the experiences that you remember, not the great photos. And those are lessons I've learned many times over. So when I wasn't really applying that, I knew it. It's not that I didn't come home, look back and wish that I had done it more. I was there and I knew I should be doing it more, but I knew I should be getting out. And I knew that what really mattered and would make this memorable was the time we spent with other people and the experiences we had and the time we spent together. But, there's only so many hours in a day, and I'd made all these commitments, and I spent a lot of time in a studio doing making work, despite being in these locations that, sometimes, especially Greenland is sort of really a once in a lifetime opportunity. So to me, that became sort of an interesting juxtaposition too, of I guess maybe it does come through in Norths too, how I was thinking about the Norths and the travel, but I was also thinking about, I guess in life in general, the whole work-life balance and getting your priorities straight. And in the arts and comics and all that kind of thing, it's just so much work and it's so labor intensive. And if you're going to churn out these kinds of projects, you need to put so much time towards them. But at the same time, yeah, what's most important, especially when you have small kids, they're only small for so long. And it does feel like that's what you should be enjoying.
Now that you mention that, it does seem to be a theme, what you just mentioned, the life-work balance, enjoying those that you're around, family members, all of that. It's a theme of Norths, the new book, but it doesn't come out and maybe slap you as an overt theme, but it is important because you do make certain comments throughout about spending time with the family, doing the work that you're committed to with the residencies, getting out and just enjoying the outdoors or seeing new sights or whatever the case may be. But yeah, and in this way, I was curious if you would consider Norths something like or maybe very much like a diary comic.
Oh yeah, I think it's a diary comic for sure. Kind of a journaling project of some description.
Okay, so the follow-up question to that is, do you consider this a comic?
That I don't think I consider it. I wonder if I consider it a comic. So definitely a graphic endeavor, a visual. I don't think I consider it a comic. I've struggled to find the right name for it. And do you have a good? Do you? How would you refer to it?
I don't know. There's a part of me that does consider this, depending on your definition of comics, a comic in that we do have a series of sequential images that arguably are panel-like, that do in some way kind of tell the narrative. On the other hand, the text that you provide, in other words, what you write to people on the back of the postcard, is the images are heavily dependent on the text that you provide. So, but then again, there's some comics that the images could stand alone, but they don't necessarily have to. I like to think of Norths as more of a hybrid text, that there are parts of this that bear a similarity to comics. Maybe you could call it maybe even a comics cousin. On the other hand, there are other things going on in the text that wouldn't necessarily be defined as comics.
That all defines it. Yeah, that explains it all pretty well. Yeah, I think some pages, the relation between the image and the text, like they are a lot more tied together and need each other. And in some, like the image would stand alone and the text would stand alone. And in the aesthetics too, like some are more, on some of the postcards, there's definitely text and imagery interacting in what was much closer to a traditional sort of comic idea. So yeah, I probably wouldn't define the entire book as a comic, but definitely, I like the cousin thing. Okay. I can get behind it. It's a close cousin of comics.
Close cousin. Good enough. And, we should mention again that the format of Norths is unique in that, I guess, in essence, what you've done is to take copies of the various postcards that you were sending to a variety of different people while you and Patrice and Riel were in those northern climates. And you were sending those, and on the back of the postcards, you're writing about like what's going on with you or your family, the work that you're doing at the residency, or the sites that you were able to see or not see. The front of the postcard is an illustration. I mean, it's not just a postcard that you got and then sent someone. You created the postcard. So that's the image. And then the text on the back is the messages that you sent people. And then you collected all of these. So the shape of this book, Norths, is postcard shaped. So it has a horizontal look to it, and it's like flipping through a series of postcards, every now and again with you inserting maps and chapter divisions and sometimes explanations and definitions.
Yep, that describes it very well. It's a little brick of a book.
Now, I'm curious. I was looking at throughout the text the various people, or at least the locations where you were sending the postcards. Who were you sending these postcards to?
Well, so this was partially a fundraising idea, though not a very good fundraising idea, I might add, if anyone is inspired by this. But so the idea was that I was selling every date that I was gone. So before I left, I made up these big calendars, if you will, for the 6 months. And then I had a big event here in Yellowknife, which is where I live, a pre-departure event. And at that event, people could pick a date. Each day was $20. And then first come, first served. And they'd give me $20, and then they could write their name and address down on whatever date wasn't yet taken. So people would pick, lots of people picked them for, say they'd pick their birthday, or they'd pick a date that was meaningful, or they'd pick, say they knew that I was going to be in Russia in February, then they'd pick a date in February because they were hoping to get a postcard from Russia. Or, some people would pick a date from each of the countries so that they'd have a little series. And they would just, pay $20 and write down their address on that date. And some people, so that's why there are a lot of postcards going to Yellowknife, is that it's local people here who are picking a postcard for themselves. But then a lot of people sort of got really into the idea of, people, friends, family getting original art in the mail, snail mail from, these fairly exotic destinations. So people would buy dates as birthday presents or for friends and family. And so that's why there's all kinds of places all over Canada and internationally. There were a few as well. So most of the people I was sending these postcards to, I didn't know, or at least half of them I didn't know, I'd say. So that also sort of influenced my writing a little bit, in that, I didn't really know necessarily who I was writing to, and I knew that the postcards were all going to be going into a book, so I wanted them all to sort of build on each other and build an ongoing narrative. But then I needed each postcard to stand alone so that each person who was receiving it, especially if they weren't especially aware of the project, were going to be getting a postcard that did make sense and just could be read. So that made it a good writing challenge. And that's how there came to be all these postcards going to all over Canada and somewhat internationally as well.
And you can tell in some of the postcards, the individuals that you're sending them to, that you knew on a more personal basis, because you include sometimes in the margins little notes and questions like, how is so-and-so, or did you ever, do what you said you were going to do? So those people seem closer to you in those instances.
Yeah, and that was hard. That was a challenge too, because for people I was really close to, it felt a bit like the postcards suddenly, it did seem very impersonal. But at the same time, postcards, I don't think, when I thought up this project, I hadn't really given much thought to how short a postcard actually is. There isn't that much space to write. So when I was first trying to write the first few, I did draft them out, on the side first, I realized that there was just no space for small talk. I couldn't really do much of the how's so-and-so and, how's the weather and have you made, all the little personal things I would have thought I would have added in a letter to a friend. There was just no space for it. Or if I added that, there was just no room for building on the narrative or for adding information that would be interesting to someone reading the book.
Now, when you and Patrice and Riel left for this 6-month tour, you left in late fall and into winter.
Yep.
and you even comment about this one or two places in the book that, your friends were asking, why leave for northern climates at that time? So I'm going to ask you, why leave in November for places like Finland, Russia, Greenland?
It's a combination of two things. One reason I think is that, to me, the North really is north in the winter. The real sort of, it feels more northern in the winter when it's really dark and snowy and cold. And somehow I felt that these northern destinations would really be themselves, or more, their northern identity would shine through more in the winter, was the main reason we chose that time of year. And the other one was just logistics, how long it took to get it organized, when the residencies were available, in terms of, because Patrice was going to have to take 6 months off work, it made more sense for it to be in the winter for him, was another big reason. Mm-hmm. And also Riel's birthday, he turned 2 on March 31st. So that sort of impacted when our 6 months would end and when we had to leave to squeeze 6 months in before he turned 2. So a combination of, the practical reasons and the more I don't know, not philosophical, but the more northern identity reason.
Well, let's talk about that northern identity. What is it about northern climates that draws you so?
Well, the North, and here, once again, I hesitate to say the North because there are so many different Norths and so many different ways of defining North and all of that. But the North as I experience it, let's say Yellowknife and the Yukon and this sort of semi-urban subarctic North, Canadian North is, and it's probably somewhat like this in Alaska too. It's these are towns that are quite transient, and that of course lots of people come from here and are born and raised here and around here, but a lot of people have moved here in their lifetime. And lots of people come here for a summer. And then, the big joke is, I came here for a summer 20 years ago, or I came here for a summer 30 years ago. Or in mine and Patrice's case now, we came here for a summer 10 years ago. It's like these are towns, places that some people seem to come to, and then it just feels right. It just feels like home. And you just sort of fall in love with the North, or this North anyway. And some people don't like it at all, of course. Some people are here, come for work for a couple of years, and then they're out of here as fast as they can. But some people it just really seems to speak to. And I'm not sure what really, what we fall in love with. Mostly I'd like to think it's just sort of a sense of community. But there's something else too about I don't know if it's the light or it's very hard to put your finger on. But there are definitely lots of people up here you talk to, and probably in Alaska as well, who would just say something about the gut feeling and it just feeling right and feeling like home. So, and that's how it was for me. The first time I made it north of the 60th parallel was when I hitchhiked up to the Yukon, up the Alaska Highway, and when I was 21, so 10 years ago, before I graduated from university. And at some point, once I got far enough north, it just sort of started feeling right. And then people would tell me that, I came for a summer, watch out, you'll still be here in 20 years. And I thought, yeah, that'll probably be me. And then it wasn't. I left at the end of that summer and went back home and went back to school. But then sure enough, then we came back to Yellowknife and it did become us. Like we did find our North. So, I guess for me, there's that it's a kind of inexplicable draw north. Just always, and now I've traveled so much all over the North in northern Canada, and now quite a lot all around the world, and it just generally kind of felt right to us. It just felt like home as we went, and I don't know what makes it feel that way.
Much of what you're saying now reminds me of your earlier book, Ramshackle, A Yellowknife Story, that was released also by Conundrum Press in 2015. And now I have read Ramshackle before Norths, and so I feel that I got a pretty good context of your relationship with Northern Canada before I read the new book, Norths. Now, Ramshackle, for those who may not be aware, is more of, let's say, a straightforward narrative than what you have in Norths. And it's about your experience, along with Patrice, of heading up to Yellowknife and making a, so to speak, summer stay last for years, correct?
Yep, that defines it pretty well. Yeah, it's the story of us moving, I guess, discovering Yellowknife and falling in love with it was the short the short description. And it's a combination of I'm almost comic strips to a degree, like short little anecdotes about our first summer here, just getting to know the town and the little quirks of the town and just of the lifestyle that we had where we were here, and we were trying to live out of our van, but I still had an office job. So that sort of a contrast between sleeping in the van, but trying to be respectable by day and not too scruffy. And since we're so far north, it never gets dark. So sleeping in a car is kind of miserable and lots of mosquitoes. And then we slowly move up in the world to house sitting. And then that's a whole other way of getting to know the community and how people live in different parts of town. And then we get to know the parts of Yellowknife that we really like, which is a part of Yellowknife called Old Town, and where there's a bit more of that, I don't know, frontier spirit, or, it's a bit more anarchic in its layout and in the lifestyles. And there are houseboats and shacks and little crooked houses and also big expensive houses. But that whole sort of alternative setup really speaks to us that summer. And we eventually end up moving into a little shack without running water, and how we get to really know and love that community. And there's those anecdotes are interspersed with sections on the history of Yellowknife and the context for these houseboats and shacks and the town and how all of it came to be what it is today. So yeah, Ramshackle is really the inception of our love story with the North.
Yeah, one of the things I really enjoyed about Ramshackle is, how do I put this? It in many ways, it's like a growth narrative. In other words, you and Patrice decide to just head up north, just to do it. And it's becoming acquainted with Yellowknife, learning some of the ins and outs, being surprised by many things, getting used to certain things, having to put up with things like mosquitoes, and sleeping in your van. And by the way, to me, one of the most striking parts of Ramshackle is the fact that you guys bought a used, how did you put it, a soccer mom van?
Soccer mom van, yeah.
And then tore out the back and put in a mattress so that you guys would have a place to sleep, not only driving up to Yellowknife, but also living there for a while out of your van.
Yep, no one suspects the soccer mom van was our...
That's smart.
Well, they're good on gas, it's not like a whole camper van, and they're a dime a dozen. Like they're pretty, there are lots of those older soccer mom vans kicking around, and yeah, like when you're trying to camp discreetly, like, yeah, no one suspects it, but it is pretty cramped. Like we built a bed frame so that we could have storage underneath, but then of course, I mean, they're not designed to be lived in, or those vans. So once you've built a bed frame, then you can't quite sit up on the bed. And we're sort of average height people. We're not especially small or especially tall, but yeah. So as soon as we were hanging out in the van, we'd just be sitting on the bed, but with our shoulders all hunched over and our heads bent down because we couldn't quite sit up straight. So it definitely wasn't. It's good enough for sleeping, but not really good enough for living. Like, you don't want it to rain too much.
And, I have to admit, I am completely ignorant of Canadian Northern Territories. And so my exposure to it is through texts such as yours, not only Norths, the new book, but also Ramshackle. And the way that you're describing Yellowknife and Ramshackle is that, as you mentioned, there are really nice and expensive homes, but those are also juxtaposed with shacks and more modest housing. And you and Patrice seem to be drawn to the more, I guess, shack-worthy dwellings.
Yeah. For us, it was just, we just fell in love with all those little shacks. I think something about how it contrasts with, I think we were still at a phase and an age where like the idea of the suburbs was just something that was really scary and depressing. And don't get me wrong, I'm still not a big fan of suburbs, but I don't think they scare me as much as they did. But at that time, just sort of that idea of like just ending up somehow living in this house with this perfect green grass and just where all the houses would look the same and everyone's driving and whatever that suburban nightmare to us was, this was the complete opposite. Nothing was, everything was crooked, nothing was built to code, and everything was colorful, and you could sort of do anything you wanted within reason, and it just had so much more character and spirit and community. It really just felt right. It was a bit the way coming north felt right, just finding that slightly alternative, crooked lifestyle that also just really felt good and right. And we just really fell in love with that. The houseboats as well. There are houseboats up here that are on the bay, and they're not like the houseboats that you see more often down south that are lined up along docks. Like these are really out in the bay and just sort of anchored and floating around. So those houseboats are also sort of an off-grid way of living, and also colorful and all different shapes and sizes. And some are pretty fancy and some are just like little shacks just floating on the bay. So yeah, all that alternative stuff for that really spoke to us. Yeah, and
those houseboats can be quite challenging when things start to freeze.
Yeah, this time of year, when it freezes and when it thaws are the two big challenging times. So there's freeze up and break up. So because in the winter, once it's actually frozen, you can just drive on the bay. Like the lake's frozen for a big part of the year. And then it's not that different to living on land. I mean, and by that I mean living on land in a house that doesn't really have running water or electricity, but at least you can drive there and you can walk there and your house isn't floating and bobbing around. But on the cusp seasons, and some years the transition is easier than others, but as it freezes up and as it thaws, like right now, there's a whole period of, you're walking, you can't drive on the ice, and the sides melt first. It melts closer to shore, and often around the houses it melts. But then there's still ice to walk on in the middle, so you're sort of in and out of your canoe and dragging your canoe to be safe, so that you can jump into your canoe if all of a sudden you go through the ice, and makes you generally need the canoe at like close to the shore and then close to your house again. And that's all very tricky because the ice gets a bit iffy, and sometimes it can last a while of sort of thawing and then freezing again and thawing again. And so that's what's happening right now these days. Like late May, like this is by early June, normally it's mostly thawed. And in the fall, it's a bit same kind of thing in reverse. But in the fall, you sort of have to make sure your house freezes in straight. Because if your house doesn't freeze in level, then you have 6 months of your house not being level. So there are a few more things to consider like that when it's freeze up season.
Well, your preference for the pioneer spirit definitely comes out in Ramshackle. And toward the end of the book, you write how you and Patrice ended up in a place called the Woodyard, which is, I guess, well, at least when you guys lived there, almost nothing but shacks, correct?
Yep, it's a whole little cluster of shacks down by the lake, down by the bay.
Yeah, and one of the most striking parts of that experience was with something that I was unfamiliar with, honey buckets.
Yep, people. There's lots of toilet discussions around the honey buckets. So in I was going to say in Yellowknife, but even throughout the Arctic, wherever it isn't really possible to have pipes, so often like in the Arctic, because of permafrost, you can't really dig down and have pipes. And in some parts in smaller communities in the north, people will have trucked water. They'll have, one water tank and one sewage tank, and then there are trucks that come around and deliver water and collect sewage. So some places, the entire community has that set up. People are living in regular houses, with electricity, and when they turn the taps, there's water that comes out. So actually living in the house feels, the same as living in a house in most places in North America. But there is like this trucked component that if the water delivery truck doesn't come, you can run out of water, and you have to make sure that sewage pump out does happen, because otherwise your sewage tank will just get full. So that's part of the day-to-day logistics and setup. But in bigger cities, that's not as common at all. But in Yellowknife's Old Town and a couple of other neighborhoods, there is that system as well of trucked water and sewage collection. So even the nice, like fancy Old Town houses have that system, because in Old Town it's built on the bedrock on the Canadian Shield, and there just aren't pipes. In the summer there are surface lines. So in the summer you just have regular pipes, but in the winter you have these trucks coming to deliver water and sewage. And then when it comes to shacks, well, they're not. Some of the shacks have water tanks and water delivery, some of the slightly bigger shacks, and some of them just don't at all. So then you have no water. And then when it comes to the sewage component, none of the shacks have pump out, like none of them have sewage tanks. Some have composting toilets, which is great, great or not, depending on how well they work. But so some have the composting toilets, and some have honey buckets, and which is what we had in the Dragon Shack, which is the shack we're in the Dragon Shack and in a little white shack.
That's a great name, by the way, Dragon Shack.
Dragon Shack. Yep, I love my Dragon Shack driver's license. It was our address. So then they're basically, not to get too graphic about it, but for the same reason there can't be pipes, because it's Canadian Shield and you can't dig a big hole. You can't dig holes for pipes. You also can't dig holes to have like an outhouse like you would living in the bush in most places. So because of that, people just use buckets. And then in these buckets, there are these big, thick plastic bags that look like garbage bags, but they're not. They're thicker, the honey bags. And then, so that's your toilet. And then most people will construct a more user-friendly seating sort of option around it. So you don't really feel like you're sitting on a bucket. Like it can feel more like a regular toilet experience. But it does mean that you have to you have to switch up the bags. The bags do fill up, and then you have to put a new bag in. And when we first arrived in Yellowknife, we arrived in 2009, and up until I think it was 2010, the city were still involved with the whole honey bucket situation. So you could just still put your honey bags out to a station by the side of the road, and they got collected. I bet the way garbage gets collected. And the city supplied us with other new bags. So there was a rotation of bags and buckets, and that was all sort of still, the city was still involved. And then by the time, by 2010, I think the city sort of took a step back, and we started having to bring our own bags to the dump. You can go to the Yellowknife dump, and then there's a big container for it, and it says on it that it's for honey buckets and dog poop, I think is the other that goes there. So you still have to bring your own bags of waste to the dump, and you can just go and buy the bags at the grocery store and they stock them in one of the stores in Old Town. So yeah, that was a big, the whole water and sewage situation is quite a big part of the off-grid lifestyle. It is something you have to think about a lot more when you don't have it. And there are quite a lot of jokes and humor relating, not that it's all potty humor, but there is quite a lot of mention of the honey buckets and the trucked water and sewage in Ramshackle. It was something that was noteworthy to us coming from southern Canada, where that isn't very common.
Yeah, and that was my experience in reading Ramshackle, is that it made me realize a lot of the things that many of us, especially south of the border, kind of take for granted, right? Piped water, sewage systems, toilets, things of that sort. And then reading about your experiences in Ramshackle and what you and Patrice had to deal with when you first got there, what you had to learn, I think was quite eye-opening.
And yes, it was, we had to learn it, and it was all mostly fun for us. It was part of that not being in the suburbs and everything not being identical and asepticized. And for us, there was sort of even though it was inconveniencing, and once in a while things went a bit wrong with the systems, like, I think we still enjoyed how different it was. And I do want to make it clear, though, that, like, you say south of the border, but for the vast majority of Canada, this is also not common. And even I wouldn't, I'd be comfortable saying that quite a lot of people in Yellowknife probably don't even know about a thing about honey buckets. And if you don't even live in Old Town, you might not even have given thought to the fact that people in Old Town are getting trucked water and sewage. So it's definitely not a common thing in Canada. And for us, it was all sort of part of the lifestyle. But in smaller communities, like in lots of Indigenous communities and people who are living like away from big centers in Canada do have, like, they don't necessarily have access to good drinking water and to good services and systems. And I suspect it may be that way in the US, so I'm not especially aware of that. But there's lots of people who don't have the water and the sewage and stuff for who it's not sort of fun the way it was for us. So I do want to clarify, like, we had the luxury of sort of enjoying the challenges, but of course it's not having proper running water isn't fun for a lot of people when it's something you haven't chosen.
Right. And, one of the things that strikes me as a big difference between your earlier book, Ramshackle, and this new release, Norths, is that with Ramshackle, you seem to, and you can tell me if this makes sense or not, you tend to dig down deep into the minutia of day-to-day living and what you go through with you and Patrice moving to Ramshackle and what you were learning. Whereas with Norths, there is quite a bit of discussion on the everyday part of existence, but it's a broader picture, right? You're literally traveling the globe, which is quite different from Ramshackle, which is you really getting deep into the living experience that you guys had in Yellowknife.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'd never really thought of it in those terms, but yeah, in Ramshackle, the whole book is about us getting to know sort of basically one town and even one neighborhood. Like, it sort of narrows down like that as we find our place. Whereas North, the entire book, we cover a lot of ground. There's a lot of we're moving around a lot, and no, that makes sense. I hadn't thought of it that way. It's a much broader look at a broader North, and in Ramshackle, it's really delving into one particular little North.
Yeah, it's the difference between hunkering down and spreading out.
Exactly.
Well, let's get back to the new book, Norths. It's been out now for a number of weeks, and you've been to TCAF, so you've had, I would hope, some experiences with reader reaction, or at least seeing people, for instance, at TCAF, who maybe first learned about this book and who discovered it while at the convention. So tell me, what's the reaction been to Norths?
Oh, I don't know. It's a bit early days to have had much feedback yet. What can I say? I've had some positive feedback for sure. I think my mom enjoyed it, which is saying something. Sorry, Mom. But yeah, the at TCAF, I had a few people who were very excited by the idea of postcards. I think there are people out there who really, I'm not I like snail mail as much as, I mean, who doesn't want to get snail mail? But I hadn't really given postcards that much thought. But I definitely met some people who felt strongly about postcards and who had various experience with postcards and postcard projects of some description or another, to whom, and the format. So to them, the format really meant a lot. And then at TCAF, I met a few other people who were really into the idea of North as well. Not necessarily people who had ever even necessarily made it North, but who just really had given the North thought and who were interested in the North and who would like to make it North. And they were excited to see a book that talked about the North, well, many Norths and our experience thereof. So, yeah, I hope they enjoy the book and I hear back from them. But yeah, there were people who were interested for different reasons. And then the whole parenting component too, like just the idea of traveling with a small child, that speaks to people as well. People are always curious how we did it, and the fact that it was possible and that we decided to take on the challenge, because I guess, yeah, from an outside perspective, it always sounds like it sounds quite striking when you just sum it up by saying we spent 6 months north of 60 traveling in the winter with our almost 2-year-old. There was a few raised eyebrows and gasps on that end too, and when you add the child component in as well. So no, I don't know. I've that's the interest people have had. I yet to. Now they've bought the book, so I hope I look forward to hearing how they to getting some feedback.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times that in addition to your work in comics and also with painting, that you also have quite a heavy hand in the fiber arts. And much of that comes out in Norths, where you describe what you're doing at some of these residencies. So for those, again, who may not be familiar with your book yet, describe the kind of work that you do with, would you call yourself a felter? Is that the correct way of putting it? Felter?
A felter? Yeah, I would say a felter. I generally say fiber arts because it sort of feels a bit more all-encompassing, but mostly it is felting that I'm doing. And yeah, I got into felting when that first summer I spent in the Yukon. So it's interesting that it coincides with my love of the North and my making work about the North. And I got into the felting at first because working with wool was just, I was living in my tent in the Yukon all summer. And so I didn't have access to studios and the kind of stuff I had when I was in art school. There was no working with, oil paints or fiberglass or all that kind of stuff when I was just living in a tent. Whereas wool, I discovered that to work on these felting projects, all I needed was the fibers, the wool, and hot and cold water. And there was a river and there was a fire, so I could heat water. And so I was able to, so I got really into the felting just sort of to make a body of work that summer. It was something that was accessible to me. And I liked how it was light and fluffy and I could have it in my tent and it wasn't going to poison me or the environment. And it was all biodegradable and really tactile and it just felt right as well. So that's how I got into the felting. And then as I started working more and more with, around northern themes, the felting made a lot of sense as well. There's somehow it's warm and soft and muffled, a bit like the snow, and it's kind of warm art. And coincidentally, to a degree, there's in the Arctic, there's quite a lot of work. People make these felt hangings made out of duffel. So they with like applique techniques. So it's quite different to what I do, but it's also got that felt dimension, like these felted pictures. So I like how even though it's very different, it's there's a connection there as well. And while I was doing these residencies, I was making big felted, mostly what I was making were these big felted mural, very large hangings that were inspired by each location where we were staying. So I would be, and they were sort of inspired by painting and illustration and drawing, but all of it rendered in wool. And so that's what I had applied to do at the residencies and what I was doing. So mostly big wall art, but also I was doing some video and stop motion animation with the fibers. And I was trying to record sound and video to bring that all together. So to develop a body of work that would reflect our experience of all these Norths. And that when I brought all this work together, it would give the viewer an experience of all the Norths and of our trip as well.
Now, on your website, AlisonMcCreesh.com, and that's one word, AlisonMcCreesh.com, you provide examples of not only your comic art and your painting, but also your felting work. And I'm fascinated by this. In the videos you had mentioned that you have links to your account on Vimeo, where you have animated work that relates to your felting. Are any of those videos or any of the images that we see under the felting section work that you produced while on that 6-month journey?
Well, I'm Googling myself just now. I'm on my website just now, and as we speak. And I'm not very good at updating my website, so I was curious. So no, the felting work isn't. None of it is, though it is all Northern inspired. It's all stuff I made over the past several years for different exhibitions with different Northern themes. But no, none of the felted pieces, this is a good reminder to update the World website, are the work that I made during the trip. I think that some of the videos I link to are, though. Yes, a couple of them are. So there's a little taste of the work, the fiber work I made during my trip. But, well, there's a good incentive. I will be updating my website sometime soon.
Okay, and I will include a link to your site in the show notes, but it is Alison McCreesh, and that's AlisonMcCreesh.com.
Yes, exactly.
So they can check out your work there.
Yep. And not to promote Facebook, but if people look up Alison McCreesh illustration on Facebook, there actually are albums with photos of the fiber work I did while I was traveling.
Oh, good. Now, one of the things that you mentioned, especially toward the end of Norths, is that you had, produced quite a bit of art while you were at these various residencies, and your intention was to create the work and mail a lot of it back home to Yellowknife. However, especially in Russia, you had some problems with getting the work sent back home.
Yes, well, one of the great things about the felting is how easy it is to ship, how forgiving it is, unlike, big canvases and stuff that you don't want to see get wrecked and that you have to be really careful with. The felting, you can sort of just fold up and roll up and it's fine and it barely weighs a thing. So that's one of the many reasons that felting has worked so well for me over the years, is that for shipping exhibitions and shipping work, there's plenty of options there. So as I went, I had planned that I would make work and then mail it home to myself, because I couldn't just keep on carrying it with me. And all the work I did in Finland, I did bring on to Russia with me, because we were going to Russia after Finland, and I had a solo show there. So some of it was work that I had shipped to Russia from Canada before I left. So my previous work about the Canadian North, and then some of the work I was showing was the work that I had made at the residency in Finland and work that I was going to be making at the residency in Russia. So by the time it came time for me to leave Russia again, I had quite a lot of work there. I had all my work from the past few years and the work I'd made so far on the residency trip. And I packaged all of that up, and it was quite difficult to package up, because as it turns out, the Russian mail is a tad different to our mail, where you can't just put any old thing in the mail. You have to be in the specific Russian post boxes, and they're quite small, so that became challenging. So I ended up having to squeeze all this work into many different boxes. And then shipping, of course, involved all kinds of filling out forms that I didn't really understand. And of course, because that's the way we are, it ended up being a rush, and it was last minute before a long weekend. And anyway, it came together in a way that seemed a bit concerning. I didn't have great faith in what was happening, but we just sort of I rolled with it. And then, as it turns out, it all got lost in the mail. It got turned back at the border, probably due to our poor efforts at completing the forms, and then it sort of bounced around the Russian post system until we lost track of it. So that transpires at the end of Norths, I think, when I start to discover that. And though it never gets resolved in Norths because it took a long time to get resolved, I can set your mind at ease and other listeners that eventually I have recently managed to get everything back. I think I have everything back now. The art center in Russia eventually managed to get every mail, and then they were wary of putting it back in the Russian post, so they've kept sending it back in increments with other artists in residence, mostly Scandinavian artists. So the artists would come, and then they would get the art center in Russia would give them a little box or a package to then mail home to me from Sweden or Finland or Norway or wherever they were going back to. And so one bit at a time, at great expense from paying for all this Scandinavian shipping, I finally managed to get all the work that I had brought there and all the work that I had made there and all the work that seemed to be lost in the mail it's now back in Yellowknife with me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because one of the questions that I had at the end of Norths was, did she ever get her mail? Did she ever get her art that she had tried to mail back to herself? So I'm glad that it had a happy ending.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I joked. I've joked a bit. That's how I know if people have read the book, because people who have read the entire book, they always ask if what happened to the art and if I got it back. So it's a giveaway. And I had something else to say about that. And I think that we were talking before too about all the questioning, the work-life balance and the priorities, and the losing that art really made me that added to my whole questioning of that. Because all of a sudden, if I didn't have the art left, then all those countless hours I'd spent in the studio making the art, instead of enjoying being where I was or enjoying the time with my family or meeting people, then it made even less sense if I didn't have anything to show for it. And that was a good, I don't know if it was a good reminder, but that definitely added to my pondering about what's really important and what sticks around and how memories will stay with you and experiences will. But yeah, this tangible art was pretty easy to lose.
Well, now, just last month, this new book, Norths, was released, and you've been to TCAF. You're home, you're settled, you have, Sam now to care for and to occupy your time. I'm curious if you're currently at work on another comics project, or if not comics, then other, maybe more fine art project.
Well, right now I'm 1 month into my second child. I'm mostly at work with the second child. I do now that Norths is out. I'm going to TCAF as well. It sort of makes it all more exciting again. I think I was quite exhausted from the traveling and the book and the project about a year ago, so I wasn't really thinking along the lines of new art projects. But now I've recovered enough and gotten excited enough about it all and started to get feedback again. And now I'm at the pondering stage. I'm at the plotting stage. But yes, I think the next big artistic endeavor will be a book again.
Well, I look forward to that when you're able to share word on that. And can people find out about what you're currently working on? Would it be better on Facebook or on your website? I'm
afraid Facebook is much better. I wish I could say the website. I wish I wasn't promoting Facebook like this, but Facebook is definitely right now where I do update and post things about my work, and I do a lot of sort of journaling and small comics and just little strips and things like that, and sketchbooks, and all of that ends up on Facebook at Alison McCreesh Illustration.
Well, Alison, it's been great talking with you about not only your new book, Norths, 2 suitcases, a stroller around the circumpolar world, but also Ramshackle and your other art.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your interest in it all and all your time.
Again, I want to thank Alison McCreesh for taking the time out of her busy new mom schedule to talk with me about the new book, Norths. That, as well as her 2015 book, Ramshackle, are wonderful reads and are great examples of the kind of material that Conundrum Press puts out. And if you want to find great books like this, then you do well to check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now, and there you'll find a variety of comics at incredible discounts. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Alison McCreesh. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also contact us via social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. There are more interviews we have in the coming days, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.